Salute Omnes, I am Ruminous, and today we're talking about the gameplay aspect of view and camera. Before we begin, yes, I shaved my head. Yes, it's shorter than I want it to be. Yes, I look like a serial killer. And no, I'm not taking questions about it. Thank you. Today we're talking about the aspect of view and camera. View is quite self-explanatory. It is the visible space available for the player. Not only is it the camera size, but also the speed and mobility of the camera and how the player can move and shift and all that kind of stuff. Older games are quite notorious for having terrible camera systems, yet that was more of a limitation of the technology and kind of the controllers, because not every, especially when you go back to NES, there was only so many buttons that we had, and the memory that was available in the systems, all that kind of stuff. So, there was more limitation on the technology rather than a fault of the developers, because they obviously probably would have wanted to do 3D and more stuff. Analog sticks weren't always a thing. They didn't always exist for the line of controls. Yes, we had joysticks way back when, and arcades had them, but they were not implemented onto controllers like the PlayStation controller. The PlayStation controller for the PlayStation 1 did not have any analog sticks. It was not part of it at all. If you look at the GameCube controller, it has one analog stick, and we were getting there, but eventually the DualShock version 1 came out and they kind of went on with that, and analog sticks became more prevalent as one, we could shift the camera 360 degrees, and we could actually move the characters 360 degrees as well. So analog sticks weren't always a thing, and so cameras were typically static, either attached to a particular position on the screen, or to the character, or able to be manipulated with certain items or certain buttons perhaps, but it wasn't really common. As technology improved, games have been able to grant the players the ability to move and control and manipulate the camera in very different ways, and most of it has been for the better, which gives autonomy to the player and actually enhances the experience to a personal level rather than just feeling kind of like a spectator at times. You know, again, it's not really much of a mark against the games from older generations because we worked with what we had. View is obviously important, as sight is the most important sense for navigation in humans. The camera needs to see enough that the player can assess the situation, but not too much that is either overwhelming or breaks the loading of the game. If it's too close, it can be nauseating or also limiting. Alright, let's beat some ass! 2D side-scrolling games look at the character from the side at all times. The view for these games tend to be north, east, and west. South or down is sometimes incorporated, usually for digging games or dungeon crawlers, but not always. The camera is fixed low with the character and will move horizontally when the character moves enough to one side. For vertical games, the camera will be centered to see unilaterally and follow the character. This game is oddly horrific for no reason. For top-down games, the camera tends to be centered on the character and give an illusion of 3D with equal view to all four cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. Camera is again often chained to the character and will move with them at all times, but there may be options to such area depending on the game. Isometric is an art and architectural style of 30, 60, 90 degree angles to give an illusion of 3D space while not giving an actual full 3D camera. The camera will tend to be higher up and follow the character's movement from above. The camera for these games tends to be fixed on a certain distance from the character, so it does limit how large the areas can be, what secrets can be hidden, the details available, all that kind of stuff. 3D is where the view is 360 degrees, giving a full view of everything around you. The camera is either first or third person. This gives the greatest amount of detail and autonomy to the player, but it's also the most expensive and time consuming for the developer. First person is through the eyes, third person is behind the head. First person is limiting in the available view, but saves on animating the character. Third person can lock the camera behind the character, where the player is unable to move the camera at all, or perhaps it is on a semi-rail, kind of static, where the moving the camera actually moves the character in some way. Or it can be completely free without any sort of rail and independent of the character, where the player moves the camera and it just goes around 360 degrees and doesn't influence the character at all. Alright buddy, I make the jokes in this thing, although I rarely make jokes in these because these are mostly video essays. Older games that allowed a movable camera still had limitations due to experience and ability. Oh god, this camera! I've seen squish snails be better at this! Gex 2, Enter the Gecko, allowed the player to shift the camera to the left, the right, or snap to the direction of the character, but the movement was slow and would often redirect itself behind the character after a few steps, which refuses the player the ability to set up the camera for a jump. The choice for the view in the camera is largely dependent on the overall design, budget, and skill of the developers. 2D will always generally be cheaper than 3D. There are also plenty of visual effects that can be done for cinematic or mechanical reasons. A grain filter may be applied when in a dream state. Don't touch me. Drake. No one's touching you. Everybody's actively trying to avoid you because you look like you're about to feel them up. Or the camera in a free view game may be dragged to a certain area to force the character or the player to see something. The lighting in certain areas may be reduced to limit the view of the player. For horror, these castles, they're just not built with wind resistance. Some games may rely entirely on building the view as part of the mechanic or aspects of the game. Beyond eyes and perception both have blind characters, and so the player uses sound to build the level around themselves as everything is empty before. Just out of curiosity, is there a speed to move that is not blind little girl speed? I understand why it's blind little girl speed, because I'm playing as a blind little girl. But it's kind of slow. I won't give example of good or bad cameras in two different games just because it's pretty intuitive. It's more of a Boolean function. It either passes or it fails. It's either a good camera or a bad camera. Yeah, there are some cameras that could have some issues at some points, but typically they don't really work that way. Instead, the primary issue when it comes to level design is in its view. If the camera is bad but the view is good, it's kind of manageable, but if the view is bad, it will always lead to an issue no matter how good the camera is. The only example I'll give from a bad camera is from Rise of the Tomb Raider, where the camera constantly repositions itself, even though the player needs to climb up and around. The camera should generally always listen to the player's command, as redirecting the camera takes away the autonomy, and can frustrate them as they make mistakes from not being able to actually see from the thing that I'm constantly trying to see. Let me do the thing I want to do! Hugs and kisses, Ruminous. Dictated but not read. Reject in, now it's time to start busting some shit. The language in this game is very inappropriate. The Mega Man Battle Network series had the same isometric view with a fixed camera throughout the entire series. The game looks nice and is detailed enough, but the visible space for the walkways is sometimes not enough to see what's ahead and where to go. Later on in the games, they will typically have larger areas with one-way speed paths and maze-like paths. It can get kind of frustrating when you're running through these things, you take a wrong speed pad, you have all these random battles, and your memory could fail you and you don't really remember exactly where you went because you can't really see far enough ahead. If the camera was like a step back and maybe gave about 25-15% more area, these issues probably wouldn't be so bad. The game is navigable and it's not bad, it's just this would help the game be a little bit better, especially for these areas if you're able to see just a little bit more. Hotline Miami is a top-down 2D game with a centered camera that follows the character. This game is brutal both in the content and the difficulty. One hit deals death to both the player and the NPCs, so there's not really a lot of lenience for errors. The view is just enough to see exactly what's ahead, behind, and to the sides. Since we're marching in and ambushing people, we are also limited in sight, just like real life. NPCs can detect a player from long distances if the line of vision is crossed, again, just like real life. The game does allow the camera to be moved about 50% more in a radius around the character, although it will pretty much require the player to stop moving. However, the view in this game is perfect for what it needs. You see just enough to plan ahead, and if you need to, you can take a minute to look around you. Camera and view are thus important since sight is the primary input stimulus that humans use to take in their surroundings, but parts or aspects can be ignored during level design or during the implementation of the particular benefits for each view type. The camera gives the player the ability to see the world around them, but giving too much can dilute the finer details and perhaps overwhelm the player, but giving too little can obscure the overall level and limit the player's ability to plan for future actions. The levels need to match the limit of the camera's movement to limit the frustration of not being able to see the next area, of secrets, of the enemies. You know, you generally want to make sure the levels match the camera because you want to make sure the player can plan ahead accordingly. Games are supposed to be fun. Not having entire realism of not being able to see everything around you is great. You don't want to have to limit the player to be just like a human being. Sometimes third person is wonderful because you get to see all the things around you and you get to feel like a superhero, but that's exactly what it's supposed to be. If you make it too realistic, if you block the camera and the view too much, it leads to these kind of issues. So make sure that your levels, make sure that your secrets, make sure that your extra areas, make sure that your combat, make sure your conflict or what your puzzles, whatever you're doing, match what the camera and the view can do. Thanks everybody for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified of future videos. If you have any constructive criticism, anything that you think that I missed, anything that you think that I got wrong, please leave it in the comment section below to continue this discussion. Next week, we will move on to the gameplay aspect of growth. Until then, walete omnes.